The ballroom sparkled under the intense glow of crystal chandeliers, casting golden reflections across the walls, decorated with mirrors and Renaissance moldings. Every detail exuded wealth. Tables adorned with rare flower arrangements, waiters circulating with trays of imported champagne, and guests dressed in clothes so expensive they could buy a house. The orchestra, positioned on a raised platform, played a captivating melody that filled every corner of the room, imposing an air of majesty. It was the ball of the year, the place where only the elite felt at home. The women, covered in jewels, smiled with veiled arrogance, as if each glance were a silent judgment. Men in perfectly tailored tuxedos greeted each other with calculated gestures, discussing business disguised as small talk. The sound of heels on the polished marble blended with the rhythm of the music, creating an almost rehearsed cadence. Everyone seemed to belong to the same show, and in this show, every detail had been rehearsed to reaffirm status and power. But then the side doors opened almost imperceptibly. A female figure crossed the threshold, unintentionally drawing attention. The young woman, with a delicate face, wore a simple dress patched in several spots, which clashed with all the ostentation around her. Her bare feet contrasted sharply with the other women's crystal shoes and stiletto heels. The murmur began discreetly, but soon spread into waves of giggles and snide comments. She stopped in the middle of the room, hesitant, taking a deep breath to keep from backing away. She felt the stares, like blades piercing her skin, each laugh like an invisible slap. A nervous flush colored her cheeks, but there was something in her eyes that couldn't be erased, a quiet dignity, firm as stone. She wasn't there to compete with anyone, but her mere presence was an act of defiance. And that, in itself, sparked collective unease. "Who let her in?" whispered a lady in a cobalt blue dress. "Bare feet! How outrageous!" said a gentleman, lifting his chin. Others merely pointed, laughing as if witnessing a ridiculous spectacle. The sound of the whispers became a deafening buzz, a cruel chorus that seemed to want to push her back out. Still, the young woman stood her ground, determined not to flinch at the mockery. Across the room, a group of young men toasted as they watched the scene. For them, the girl's entrance was a source of amusement. With each snide comment, the laughter grew louder, fueling the mocking atmosphere. The room felt like an arena, and she, the weaponless gladiator, faced a crowd awaiting her downfall. Yet there was no fear in her steps, only a calmness that made it clear she wasn't about to run away. Among the guests, discomfort was shared. Some were amused by the intruder's boldness, others watched with a certain curiosity, and a few, very few, seemed to feel compassion. A waiter, passing by with a tray, gave her a brief look of sympathy. This simple gesture helped her avoid giving in to panic. Even though tiny, that spark of support was enough to keep her steady. High on the main wall, an imposing clock began to chime. The chimes echoed throughout the hall, carrying a symbolic weight impossible to ignore. It was the signal that the evening's main waltz was about to begin. For the elite, it represented the highlight of the ball. For the young, it meant being even more exposed, the moment when all eyes would turn to the center of the dance floor. Each second seemed to drag by, the metallic sound of the clock heightening the tension in the air. She took a deep breath, trying not to show weakness. Her heart was pounding, but her erect posture defied judgment. The orchestra was already preparing for the first note, tuning their instruments. The guests, excited with anticipation of the dance, still cast contemptuous glances in her direction, as if eagerly awaiting the depths of her boldness. In that moment, the contrast was stark. On one side, the rehearsed perfection of an elite who lived to flaunt their power. On the other, the apparent fragility of a young woman without shoes, but who carried within her something no one else possessed: quiet courage. The clock ticked, and the tension promised to explode the moment the music began. The stage was set, and her fate would be decided before everyone's eyes. Among the guests enjoying the scene, one man in particular stood out. Tall, imposing, his face marked by the self-confidence of someone who had never been challenged, he carried in his posture a certainty of superiority. His black suit was tailored, his shoes shone like mirrors, and his watch of gold on his wrist seemed to silently announce his fortune. More than money, he exuded power, and he used that power as a weapon to subjugate everyone around him. His name was Richard Morgan, a millionaire known not only for his successful businesses, but also for the arrogance that oozed from every gesture. In society, he was both admired and feared. Admired for his colossal fortune, feared for the pleasure he took in humiliating those weaker than himself. For him, life was a constant display of status, and every situation was an opportunity to prove himself above others. As soon as the young woman entered the ballroom, Richard noticed her, not with curiosity, but with the predatory gaze of someone who senses an opportunity for cruel entertainment. While many guests merely chuckled discreetly, he was already plotting something bigger. For him, this barefoot, out-of-place figure was a perfect opportunity to reassert his dominance. The ballroom, after all, was his territory, and no one dared question his words or actions. With each step the girl took across the room, Richard's smile widened. It was as if he'd already decided she would be the show of the evening. He toasted with his friends, loudly commenting on how funny the audacity of poverty could be. Each comment drew laughter from his circle of sycophants who competed with each other to please him with new jokes about the intruder. The collective laughter reinforced his sense of absolute control. Richard was a master at manipulating audiences. He knew how to choose words that elicited easy laughter and, at the same time, painful humiliation in his victims. It was a game for him, and everyone knew it. Some more sensitive guests looked away, but no one dared confront him. The fear of falling into social disgrace outweighed compassion. Thus, the entire room seemed to be on his side, prepared to watch the spectacle he would create. He raised his glass slowly, the gesture calculated to attract attention. His deep voice cut through the din, commanding attention as if he were a master of ceremonies. "Look here, ladies and gentlemen," he said, discreetly pointing at the young woman. "Even our parties now welcome exotic attractions." The comment was met with a burst of laughter. The young woman, huddled in the corner, felt the floor grow even heavier beneath her bare feet. As everyone laughed, Richard leaned back in his chair with the confidence of someone who knew nothing could harm him. His face displayed a perverse pleasure, the gleam in his eyes reflecting more than light, reflecting the inflated ego of someone who lived to be applauded even at the expense of others' pain. For him, the young woman's presence was not an affront, but a gift. An opportunity to transform the ball into your personal arena. His thoughts grew bolder by the moment. It wasn't enough to laugh at her. He wanted to make an example of her. Show everyone that daring to mingle with his elite had a price. So he silently planned the public humiliation that would come, and within him was the arrogant certainty that nothing could go wrong. The audience was his. The hall was his, and even the young woman's fate seemed to rest in his hands. Between sips of champagne, Richard whispered to his friends, "Let's give her a chance to prove she deserves to be here. Imagine what can happen when misfortune dances before us." The cynicism in his words chilled some hearts, but drew laughter from most. The plan was about to unfold, and the public, without even realizing it, was already primed to become accomplices. Deep down, however, Richard was oblivious to one crucial detail. His arrogance blinded him to any possibility of defeat. He couldn't imagine that someone like her could turn the tables. For him, the night was already decided. It would be another display of his power over the weak. But in that hall, something invisible was beginning to move, setting the stage for the giant's downfall. Richard, already fueled by the pleasure of mockery, raised his golden champagne flute like a scepter. The gesture caught everyone's attention, and within seconds the room fell silent. The orchestra was still playing, but no one seemed to hear the soft notes. All eyes turned to him, eagerly awaiting the next display of power. Richard lived for this kind of moment, when he could transform an entire party into his personal stage. With a smile that blended charm and venom, he discreetly pointed toward the young woman. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said loudly, each word laden with theatricality, "it seems we've been graced with a different guest tonight." Nervous giggles erupted throughout the room. The young woman, already cornered by the stares, felt her stomach tighten, but she remained firm, as if rooted to the spot. Richard continued, savoring the rising tension. "She came to us so unexpectedly, and I, generous as I am, believe we should give her the chance to show why she deserves to be here." The audience began to whisper. Some smiled in anticipation, others frowned, uncomfortable with the cruelty in the air. But no one dared interrupt him. The millionaire had the entire room in his hands. Then he launched his coup. "My proposal is simple. If our special guest can waltz without missing a step, she will receive tonight's respect. Otherwise, well, we all know the proper place for those who invade luxurious palaces." The silence that followed was crueler than the laughter that came before. It was a public trial, and the young woman stood alone before him. Her face burned red. Her fingers clenched against the fabric of her torn dress, as if trying to summon courage. Her heart pounded, nearly choking her breath. The humiliation was complete. It wasn't enough to be the intruder. Now she would be the spectacle of the night. Yet her eyes didn't waver. They looked directly at Richard, revealing a firmness that surprised even some of the guests. The first bursts of laughter echoed from the millionaire's circle of friends. "This will be fun," one of them said, laughing loudly. "Just imagine the scene." The sound spread, infecting part of the audience. Some guests shook their heads in disapproval, but most waited as if expecting a duel. The entire room seemed suspended, divided between curiosity and malice. Richard raised his glass again, toasting as if he had already secured victory. "A simple dance. Is that too much to ask?" he teased. His voice dripped with irony, and each word was an arrow fired at the girl's dignity. To him, her defeat wasn't just likely, it was inevitable, and this certainty made the cruelty on his face almost triumphant. She took a deep breath, fighting the urge to disappear. She remembered nights spent dancing alone in deserted streets, using imaginary music as a refuge from hunger. That memory rekindled a forgotten flame. She might not have jewelry or shoes, but she had something none of those guests would ever know: the courage to survive without anything. That flame now flickered in her eyes. The room was in suspense. Eyes hung heavy as chains, but also betrayed anticipation. Could someone like her possibly dare accept? The murmur grew, and some began discreetly placing bets on the outcome. Richard watched with an almost sadistic pleasure, as if already savoring the intruder's downfall. But there was something in his smile that hid a hint of nervousness, an insecurity buried beneath layers of arrogance. And then the silence was broken by the young woman's deep breath. She lifted her chin and with a firm voice, despite her inner tremor, declared, "I accept." The room held its breath. Richard raised his eyebrows in surprise for a moment, but then his cynical smile returned. The game was on, and everyone knew that from now on, nothing would be the same. Stories like this show how courage can change destinies. Subscribe to the channel and follow other inspiring stories. As soon as the words "I do" echoed through the hall, shock ran through the guests. Some laughed louder, believing the young woman's boldness would only increase her embarrassment. Others, however, fell silent, intrigued by her unexpected courage. The orchestra paused its preparations, awaiting the outcome of the provocation. The heavy silence fell like a veil over everyone present, and every gaze was riveted to her. Despite the firmness in her voice, the young woman trembled inside. Her sweaty hands clutched the worn fabric of her dress, as if seeking support in every stitched line. Her heart pounded frantically, and the fear of tripping consumed her. She knew that a single slip would mean not only defeat, but eternal humiliation. It was a devastating risk, but retreating seemed even more painful. For a moment, doubt gripped her. Richard's gaze, fixed and penetrating, felt like a crushing weight on her shoulders. He smiled, as if already savoring victory, certain she wouldn't have the strength to go all the way. The audience's whispers echoed in her mind. She won't make it. It'll be a disaster. Insecurity almost made her retreat. But then something unexpected happened. As she passed by with a silver tray laden with glasses, a waiter paused for a second. His eyes met hers, and there was more than curiosity in the look. There was sympathy. He said nothing, but the silent glow on his face was enough to rekindle a spark of courage. It was as if he were saying, "Don't give up." The simple gesture strengthened her. She took a deep breath, trying to regain control of her nerves. She knew this moment was much bigger than a dance. It wasn't just about proving her worthiness to Richard or the guests, but to herself. If she backed down, she would confirm everyone's perception of her, that of someone fragile, incapable. If she had gone all the way, at least she would have fought. The orchestra retuned its instruments, as if waiting for the signal. Each preparatory chord seemed to mock her, reminding her that the challenge was seconds away. The clock, high on the wall, continued to tick away, reinforcing the weight of the choice. The entire hall held its breath, awaiting the next move of the intruder who had dared to challenge a millionaire. Richard, for his part, watched with eyes shining with cruel anticipation. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his legs and raising his glass as if appreciating an exclusive spectacle. To him, the girl's hesitation was not a sign of courage, but of weakness. He could already imagine the scene of her fall, the collective laughter that would follow, and the glory of having defeated her in public. His arrogance allowed for no other possibility. But the young woman didn't back down. She straightened her shoulders and fixed her eyes. On the center of the hall, where the first couples were already beginning to take their positions, this was where the judgment would take place. Every muscle in her body screamed for flight, but her soul held her steady. If this were the battlefield, she would face her fate with her head held high, even if the result was shame. The guests murmured, some in anticipation, others in contempt. One woman muttered, "How foolish! She should leave before she goes through that." But no one applauded or cheered. The room was a silent courtroom, and the young woman was the defendant about to be tried. The tension was so thick it felt like a knife could cut it. Deep down, she knew she faced an impossible choice. Retreating meant fading into oblivion as the butt of jokes. Moving forward meant risking her own dignity in front of everyone. But in that moment, she realized something. It didn't matter what they thought. It only mattered how she would see herself afterward. And with that conclusion, she decided to face the challenge to the end. The orchestra received the conductor's signal, and the hall was filled with anticipation. The instruments were raised in unison, and the first chord of the waltz echoed like soft thunder, spreading across the golden walls. The sound seemed to pulse directly through the young woman's chest, and she took a deep breath to keep from collapsing. It was the moment of truth, and there was no turning back. She walked to the center of the room. Each step echoed, firm and silent, as if belying the nervousness burning inside her. The cold marble floor bit into her bare feet, but she didn't allow the pain to show. The muffled laughter of some guests still pierced the air, betting against her, but when she reached the center, she lifted her chin, defying all gazes. Richard watched with a hunter's smile. For him, this was just the prelude to an inevitable downfall. Leaning back in his chair, he shook his glass like someone already celebrating someone else's defeat. His eyes shone with cruel satisfaction, and every move the young woman made was a step toward ridicule. The millionaire had no doubt. Victory was already his. The young woman's first steps were hesitant, almost shaky. Her racing heart seemed to confuse her rhythm, and for a moment she thought she would stumble. A group of guests stifled their laughter, ready to burst out laughing. But instead of falling, she adjusted herself, gliding smoothly across the room. It was as if her body began to remember something it had always known. She closed her eyes for a moment and let the music guide her movements. The sound of the violin enveloped her, transforming tension into lightness. Her arms moved gracefully, and her feet, though bare, beat the rhythm with surprising precision. The hall, once filled with jeers, was now divided between those waiting for the downfall and those silent, intrigued by the change. The whispers continued, but they no longer held the same intensity. There was something magnetic about her presence, something no one could explain. Her torn dress swirled like fine silk, reflecting the golden light of the chandeliers. With each turn, the young woman seemed less like an intruder and more like an ethereal figure, defying the rules of that ostentatious world. The show was beginning to turn around. Richard frowned, uncomfortable. What had once seemed like a spectacle of humiliation was slowly turning into something else. He raised the glass to his lips, but didn't drink. His eyes narrowed, searching for the mistake he still believed was inevitable. "She's going to stumble," he muttered to himself, trying to reassure himself. But the audience wasn't laughing as they had before. The conductor, sensing the intensity of the scene, led the orchestra with more energy. The notes grew louder, and the young woman accompanied each one as if she had practiced it all her life. The hall, now silent, seemed mesmerized. Even those who had previously despised her began to observe with concealed respect. Something was changing in the atmosphere. She knew there was still a long way to go, but she also knew she was no longer alone. Each correct step weakened the laughter and strengthened her own confidence. The fear hadn't disappeared, but it no longer ruled the stage. For the first time, he felt he could dance not to prove something, but because music ran through his veins. When she completed her first perfect spin, a murmur of surprise ran through the hall. It wasn't just about surviving the humiliation anymore. It was about conquering the stage. The orchestra was still vibrant. The audience held its breath, and Richard, frozen in his seat, began to realize that perhaps he had made a mistake in underestimating this girl. With each beat of the music, the young woman found a little more steadiness in her steps. The fear that had previously dominated her body began to transform into energy, and this energy, guided by the melody, gave her a rhythm of her own. Her bare feet no longer felt vulnerable against the cold marble. Now they were precise instruments, connected to the orchestra's sound. The guests watched with wide eyes. Some, previously inclined to mock, now exchanged looks of surprise. What had begun as a cruel bet was becoming a spectacle of unexpected beauty. It was impossible not to notice how the young woman, even in simple clothing, radiated something no expensive gown could convey: authenticity. Richard, leaning back in his chair, was beginning to lose his smile. His gaze wandered between the glass in his hand and the girl's figure, which against all expectations remained impeccable. He nervously tapped his foot as if trying to set a different pace, but the room no longer obeyed his command. The atmosphere was shifting, and he felt it in every subdued applause. As the music progressed, the young woman let herself be guided by the memory of her solitary dances. In the cold streets, in the days of hunger, she danced for herself, so as not to forget that she was still alive. Now, before hundreds of eyes, it was no different. Each movement carried the weight of her story, and this gave her an invisible strength that touched even the hardest hearts. The initial tension began to give way to a reverent silence. The hall, which minutes before had vibrated with laughter and sarcasm, now seemed to hold its breath. It was as if everyone were trapped in that moment, unable to look away. Even the orchestra musicians, though trained never to waver, exchanged brief glances of admiration. With each turn, each sure step, the young woman's confidence grew. Her arms moved lightly, and the simplicity of her dress, far from embarrassing her, seemed to reinforce her authenticity. It was as if she was saying, without words, "No, I need your luxury to be worthy." This silent message crossed the room, penetrating the minds of those who judged her. Richard's grip on the glass was so tight his knuckles turned white. The spectacle was spiraling out of control, and he felt it as a direct insult. A flame of irritation began to simmer inside him. He couldn't accept that the girl he intended to humiliate would become the star of the evening. His very reputation was at stake. But the more she tried to convince herself that the fall was inevitable, the more evident the young woman's skill became. She didn't just keep up with the music, she mastered it. The entire room seemed to pulse in tune with her movements. What had once been merely a challenge was now art, and every guest began to silently acknowledge this. A faint smile appeared on the girl's face. It wasn't arrogance, but liberation. She felt that, for the first time in her life, she was seen not as an intruder, but as someone capable of shining anywhere. The heat of the gazes that had previously wounded her now became fuel. It transformed pain into power, insecurity into courage. When she completed another perfect sequence, a collective gasp ran through the audience. There was no denying it. Something extraordinary was happening before them. The young woman's courage had broken the cruel rhythm imposed by Richard and turned the planned humiliation into a silent victory. The millionaire didn't want to admit it, but he was already beginning to lose. The hall, which had vibrated with laughter minutes before, was now enveloped in a curious silence. The first notes of the waltz had been accompanied by mockery, but what followed no longer elicited the same laughter. Instead, discreet whispers began to emerge among the guests. The tone had changed. It was no longer just mockery, but surprise and doubt. "Did you see that?" murmured a lady in an emerald green dress, leaning toward her friend. She didn't miss a step. The comment was followed by cautious glances, as if admitting admiration were forbidden. Many still hoped for her to fall, but they couldn't deny the young woman's unexpected grace. Increasingly, the room found itself divided between the desire to see her fail and the inability to ignore her skill. Couples who had previously been twirling around the room began to slow down. Some stopped completely just to watch the scene in the center. It was as if her dance had become the main spectacle of the evening. The orchestra, without realizing. It played with more intensity, as if also caught up in the growing tension. The entire room gravitated around the young woman. Richard noticed this change and frowned. With each whisper that spread, his confidence melted like ice under fire. He tried to maintain his smile, but his eyes betrayed his irritation. The millionaire hadn't planned this. In his mind, the girl should have been the subject of laughter, not admiring murmurs. The situation was spiraling out of his control. Some in the audience began to shake their heads silently, as if acknowledging they had underestimated the intruder. Others, more resistant, continued to whisper dismissively, trying to hold on to their initial prejudice. But the impact was impossible to deny. With each impeccable step, the young woman proved that she was no mistake at that party, but rather an unexpected revelation. The sound of whispers mingled with the music, creating an almost magical atmosphere. "She dances better than many here," whispered a middle-aged gentleman, drawing a disapproving look from his wife. No one wanted to admit it openly, but the truth was already obvious. Something extraordinary was happening, and everyone knew it. The question now was what Richard would do about it. While the room oscillated between contempt and fascination, the young woman continued to dance, as if oblivious to everything around her. Her expression was serene, but adrenaline was pumping in her heart. Every whisper that reached her ears became fuel. She knew she could still fail, but she also knew that, in that moment, she had already won over part of the audience. Richard, trying to regain his authority, whispered venomous comments to his closest friends. "It's just luck," he would say, forcing a laugh that sounded artificial, but even his sycophants were beginning to waver. The tone of the conversations was no longer as firm. For the first in time, the millionaire realized that his word was no longer the absolute law of the room. The contrast was becoming clear. On one side, Richard's wavering power. On the other, the young woman's growing presence, sustained only by courage and talent. The whispers were no longer pure mockery, but rather restrained admiration, reluctant recognition. The audience, once complicit in the cruelty, was beginning to shift sides without realizing it. As she completed another perfect sequence, silence fell again. But this time, it wasn't a silence of contempt, but of expectation. The entire room waited, anxious to see how far she could go. Richard stared, trying to contain the fury rising in his chest. And, amidst the suspense, it was clear the dance was ceasing to be a humiliation and becoming a victory in the making. The chandeliers cast golden beams that reflected off the young woman's patched dress, transforming its rips into unexpected sparkles. Each turn created the illusion that the simple fabric was made of rare silk. The contrast enchanted the most attentive eyes. The more she moved, the less out of place she seemed in the room. Her simplicity became paradoxically her greatest beauty. Her bare feet, once a source of laughter, kept steady time. The cold marble that should have been an obstacle now served as the perfect stage. The soft sound of her footsteps seemed to blend with the music, as if she had been born for this moment. There was something almost magical about the way she dominated the dance floor, never losing her naturalness. The guests, already divided between contempt and fascination, now leaned more toward the latter. It was impossible not to notice the lightness of their movements, the delicacy with which their arms opened in perfect harmony with the orchestra. What had begun as a spectacle of cruelty transformed into a genuine performance, capable of captivating even the most skeptical. Richard felt his heart race, not with emotion, but with suppressed anger. Every suppressed applause, every admiring glance toward the young woman was an affront to his authority. He tried to keep his expression calm, but his clenched jaw betrayed his growing frustration. He couldn't admit it, but the dance he'd conceived as humiliation was backfiring on him. Meanwhile, the young woman seemed oblivious to the political and social tensions in the ballroom. Her face had a serene glow, almost innocent, yet filled with confidence. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone, yet she danced as if it were her last chance. Each step was a silent cry of dignity, each turn an affirmation that her presence was legitimate. The audience's murmur turned into a reverent silence. Some guests who had previously been laughing now leaned forward, attentive to every detail. Some discreetly wiped away a tear, touched by the power of the scene. It wasn't just the dancing that was moving, but the untold story each movement carried, a story of struggle, pain, and resistance. The orchestra, enveloped by the atmosphere, seemed to play with greater intensity. The violins vibrated, the piano resonated firmly, and each instrument joined the energy of the unexpected dancer. The conductor, his eyes fixed on her, conducted as if was in dialogue with the young woman. The music ceased to be a mere accompaniment and became a living partner in her performance. Richard shifted uneasily in his chair. He tried to find knowing glances from the other guests, but received only awkward silences. The blind support he had previously enjoyed was quickly dissolving, like smoke blown away by the wind. With each impeccable step the young woman took, it became more evident that he had underestimated not only the intruder, but also the power of truth in the face of deception. In the center of the dance floor, she twirled with almost supernatural ease. Her loose hair swayed to the rhythm of the music, and for a moment it seemed as if time had stopped. She was no longer the poor girl who had entered barefoot. She was a ballerina in full bloom, drawing breathless sighs from those who never imagined they would feel such emotion that... At night, when she completed the sequence with a perfect movement, the room reacted with a brief but audible spontaneous applause. It wasn't planned, it wasn't forced, it was sincere. For the first time, the audience didn't see her as an object of ridicule, but as someone who made them believe in something greater. Richard, noticing this, felt the ice of defeat begin to settle in his veins. Richard took a deep breath, trying to mask the discomfort that was eating away at him. The room, which had previously been complicit in his cruelties, no longer responded with the same enthusiasm to his provocations. He clutched his champagne flute so tightly that the crystal seemed about to shatter. With each perfect step the young woman took, he felt his social dominance crumble like sand blown by the wind. "It's just luck," he muttered to his closest friends, forcing a laugh that sounded fake, but even they weren't laughing as they used to. The wavering looks on his sycophants' faces made it clear something had changed. The planned spectacle of humiliation was turning into silent defeat. Richard, however, wouldn't accept it. His pride wouldn't allow him to acknowledge his mistake. He leaned back in his chair and lifted his chin, trying to regain his air of authority. He watched the young woman dance with narrowed eyes, searching for invisible flaws, tiny errors that confirmed his worldview. But the more he watched her, the more evident it became that there were no stumbles. It was as if she had been born for this moment, as if she had rehearsed for it her whole life. Her every move was a blow to his inflated ego. Richard began to tap his foot impatiently, unable to control his nervousness. His mind raced, trying to find a way to regain control of the party, perhaps with a crueler joke, perhaps with a sarcastic comment. But the audience no longer belonged to him as it once had, and this infuriated him. Sweat beaded on his forehead, even though the room was perfectly air-conditioned. The hand holding the glass trembled slightly, betraying the tension his face was trying to hide. Richard realized he was being observed not just as a host, but as a character in a story he no longer controlled. And for him, there was no greater punishment than losing center stage. Meanwhile, the young woman seemed increasingly comfortable. Her impeccable turns contrasted with Richard's rigidity, who seemed frozen in his chair. The audience began to compare, albeit silently. On one side, the lightness and courage. On the other, the arrogance stifled by insecurity. The contrast was stark, and only reinforced the millionaire's fragility in the face of the scene. Richard couldn't bear the thought of his cruel bet backfiring. In his mind, the image of being ridiculed by his own audience was unbearable. He relived in flashes past situations where he had always emerged victorious. He had never failed to subdue others. He had never lost control, and now, in front of everyone, he saw that invincibility threatened by a barefoot girl. His wounded pride turned to anger. His eyes flashed as he followed her every step. "She's going to make mistakes, she has to," he repeated mentally, like a desperate mantra. But deep down, he already felt his certainty was nothing more than denial. The audience no longer expected her failure. They expected his reaction, and that made him even more vulnerable. Some guests risked small applause, disguised as isolated claps. Richard heard it as a shot to his reputation. The sound echoed in his mind, each applause a reminder that he was losing, but instead of accepting defeat, he hardened his expression even further, as if he could intimidate the audience with his mere presence. In that moment it became clear, no matter how flawless her dance, Richard would never admit her victory. Pride was his prison, and within it there was no room for humility. But the room already saw what he couldn't. With every move, the young woman was beating him not only on the dance floor, but in the hearts of everyone watching. The young woman's heart was pounding, but instead of weakening her, it seemed to fuel each step. The fear was still there, but now it was becoming fuel. She no longer danced simply to survive humiliation. She danced to prove to herself that she was worthy. Each turn was an act of resistance, each movement a silent declaration of courage. For a moment, she closed her eyes. The music enveloped her like an invisible embrace, and the entire hall vanished. In her mind, there were no more guests laughing or whispering, no more Richard with his cruel smile. Only the sound of violins, the steady beat of the piano, and the echo of old memories remained. Cold nights on the streets, when dancing was her only way to forget the pain. When she opened her eyes again, something had changed. Her gaze no longer reflected insecurity, but firmness. With each note of the orchestra, her bare feet seemed to float above the marble. Her torn dress swirled with unexpected grace, as if designed for that moment. It was impossible to ignore the transformation. From a shy outsider, she was now the star of the show. The audience, previously divided, became increasingly admiring. The whispers faded until they died away, replaced by a reverent silence. It was like witnessing a silent miracle. The poor girl, with nothing but courage, transformed humiliation into triumph before everyone. And in that silence, her presence resonated louder than any applause. Richard, unable to believe what he was seeing, drummed his fingers on the table in growing irritation. The plan was unraveling before his eyes, and he couldn't stop it. The more she shone, the more his own image diminished. But the millionaire wouldn't give in. He insisted on believing it was only a matter of time before she stumbled. His arrogance was his last armor. The orchestra intensified the melody, as if sensing the emotional shift. The musicians played with more passion, almost in communion with the unexpected dancer. The room seemed to breathe along with her, each movement accompanied by suspended gazes, racing hearts. The spectacle Richard had planned as a joke was now the most memorable scene of the evening. The young woman felt a wave of warmth course through her body. It wasn't shame, but liberation. For the first time in a long time, she no longer saw herself as invisible or unwanted. She felt alive, dignified, capable of occupying any space, no matter how hostile. And this was reflected in her steps, which now flowed with enchanting ease. Some guests, previously complicit in the cruelty, exchanged looks of astonishment. One gentleman murmured to his wife, "She dances as if she were born to dance. This." Others, overcome with emotion, discreetly held back the lump in their throats. The audience was no longer a judge, but a witness to something greater. The fear everyone expected to see in her had transformed into a force that radiated throughout the hall. Every second was a silent victory. Each perfect movement erased past laughter and etched new memories in the minds of those present. The young woman wasn't just overcoming humiliation, she was overcoming herself, conquering the fear that had imprisoned her for so long. Her dance wasn't just technique, it was survival, it was life. When she completed another flawless sequence, a collective gasp echoed through the hall. The audience was captivated, and even the most skeptical had to silently admit that they were witnessing something extraordinary. In the center of the dance floor, the poor girl no longer seemed like an intruder. She was, in that moment, the true owner of the night. Richard pressed his lips together in a rigid line, unable to contain the anger building in his chest. The room, which should have applauded his cruelty, was now mesmerized by the young woman. He drummed his fingers against the table, each tap faster, betraying his nervousness. The feeling of losing control was unbearable. His eyes flickered toward the dance floor, following the dancer's every move with silent hostility. The triumphant smile he'd worn earlier was gone, replaced by a hard, almost somber expression. The arrogance was still there, but mixed with an insecurity he didn't allow fully to show. It was as if, with each step, a piece of his authority was being ripped away. The guests began to notice the change in his demeanor. Some, previously complicit in his jokes, avoided looking at him, afraid of becoming the target of his fury. Others watched discreetly, intrigued by the reversal of roles. The poor girl shone, while the powerful and feared millionaire cowered in silence. The scene was unprecedented for everyone. Richard tried to hide his tension, raising the champagne flute to his lips, but his hand trembled, and some of the liquid dripped down, discreetly staining his sleeve. The detail, minor to some, was noticed by many. For the first time, the host's impeccable image was shattered, revealing cracks, and these cracks were more revealing than any words. Inside, he was seething. "How dare you?" he thought, staring at her as if he could knock her down with just a look. His fury was so intense that his entire body seemed to vibrate with frustration. But what destroyed him most wasn't the dance itself, but the fact that everyone was witnessing his loss of control. For Richard, there was no greater humiliation. Meanwhile, the young woman remained steadfast. Each flawless turn was like an invisible slap to his pride, and the brighter she shone, the more isolated he became. No words could erase the impact of that scene. He who had always been a master at manipulating audiences was now just an unwanted spectator. Richard clenched his fists under the table, trying to contain the urge to interrupt everything, but he knew that any rash reaction would only diminish him further in the eyes of the watchful audience. He was trapped in his own trap. He couldn't admit defeat, but he couldn't escape it either. His fury, therefore, had to be swallowed in silence. The whispers that had previously mocked the young woman now fell upon him. "Look how pale he is," someone whispered. "He didn't expect that." The words, though discreet, were invisible daggers stabbing at his ego. Richard, who had prided himself on being untouchable, was now the subject of veiled conversation. The tables had been turned completely. The contrast in the room was stark. In the center, a simple young woman radiated strength and lightness. On the sidelines, a powerful millionaire wallowed in his own rage. The glow of the chandeliers seemed to reinforce the difference, illuminating the girl's silent victory and casting heavy shadows over Richard's closed face. He remained motionless, but deep down, he swore revenge. He would not accept being defeated in front of everyone, much less by someone he considered insignificant. The silent fury that consumed him was only a premonition that he would try to regain control. But as much as he wished, it was too late. The hall was no longer his. The music reached its peak, the orchestra's notes exploding with intensity and emotion. Each instrument seemed to vibrate in unison with the young woman's heart as she moved with absolute determination. Her bare feet glided across the marble as if made for this stage. The tension in the air was so thick that no one dared blink. She twirled in perfect synchrony, her loose hair following her movement like a living frame. The simple dress, once a source of laughter, now seemed an extension of her own courage. Every step, every turn was flawless. The room was entranced, mesmerized by the dance that had surpassed all expectations. The maestro, inspired by the scene, conducted with more vigorous gestures, drawing an unusual intensity from the musicians. The sound of the violins seemed to weep and smile at the same time. The piano marked the time firmly, like a strong, beating heart. Everything converged on that unique moment, in which the poor girl became the undisputed star of the night. Richard watched with half-closed eyes, the glass forgotten in his trembling hand. Sweat trickled discreetly down his forehead, betraying his anxiety. Each perfect step the young woman took was a blow to his arrogance. He wanted to stand up, interrupt the scene, but he was paralyzed by the collective gaze of the audience. He knew any rash gesture would make him look even more ridiculous. The young woman, for her part, no longer felt fear. The chill of the marble had disappeared, the laughter had died away, and the gazes were no longer as heavy as before. She danced as if she had been born for this moment. Her body seemed weightless, guided only by the music and the conviction that regardless of the outcome, she had already won. The guests were stunned. Some placed their hands on their chests, moved by the scene. Others, in disbelief, exchanged silent glances, as if they couldn't believe what they were seeing. The entire room was united in the same breath, as if everyone shared the same heart. It was the rare magic of an unforgettable moment. Time seemed to slow down. Each second of the waltz was a universe of tension and beauty. The young woman twirled again, her dress swirling in perfect circles, reflecting the golden light of the chandeliers. Her expression was not one of pride, but of complete surrender. She wasn't dancing to humiliate anyone. She danced because life had taught her to endure with grace. Richard, strapped to his chair, felt small for the first time in a long time. He, who had always dominated with words, was now silent. His silent fury mingled with the fear of becoming the target of laughter. The millionaire realized that it wasn't just the girl on trial that night. It was himself, in front of everyone. The entire hall awaited the outcome, as if the collective breath had stopped. Every eye was fixed on the young woman, every ear attentive to the final chord, until the chandeliers seemed to vibrate with the intensity of the scene. It was as if the entire universe had compressed into that single instant in the center of the dance floor. And then came the final sequence. The young woman spun masterfully, glided lightly, and completed the final step in perfect harmony with the orchestra. The music abruptly stopped, leaving a rapturous silence in the air. For a second, no one moved. Time seemed suspended, and the entire hall knew. They had just witnessed something extraordinary. The silence after the final chord seemed infinite. For a moment, the entire hall remained static, as if no one dared breathe. The young woman, chest outstretched and eyes serene, stood motionless in the center of the dance floor. Her simple dress still swayed slightly, echoing the final movements of the waltz. It was the image of an unexpected victory. Then, like a wave breaking a dam, applause erupted. Applause echoed from all sides, at first timid, then increasingly intense. Some guests stood, others clapped with tears in their eyes. What had begun as mockery had turned into collective admiration. The entire hall celebrated the courage of those who dared to face the impossible. The young woman bowed discreetly, as if offering silent thanks. Her teary eyes shone under the light of the chandeliers, reflecting both emotion and relief. She needed no words to express her feelings. The audience understood. She hadn't just danced. She had resisted, faced, and conquered with unbreakable dignity. Richard, on the other hand, remained motionless. His fingers tightened around the forgotten glass in his hand, nearly breaking it. His hardened face revealed the shock and humiliation he was trying to hide. While everyone applauded, he was the only one who didn't stand. That personal silence screamed louder than any applause. Eyes began to turn to him. They weren't looks of respect, but of judgment. The same guests who had once laughed at his jokes now regarded him with disdain. He was no longer the powerful host. He was the man who had tried to crush a young woman and ended up crushed by his own arrogance. His pride was shattered. The young woman, even without looking him directly in the eye, knew she had won. Her victory lay not only in the applause, but in Richard's embarrassed silence. The humiliation he had planned for her had been completely reversed. Now, it was he who had become small before everyone, trapped by the weight of his own cruelty. An elderly gentleman stood up and shouted, "Bravo!" The applause grew even louder, turning into a standing ovation. The young woman smiled humbly, but inside, her heart pounded like never before. This was more than social approval. It was proof that her dignity was greater than any fortune. The sound echoed off the hall's walls, reverberating like thunder. Each clap was a reminder that the impossible had happened. The poor, barefoot and humiliated girl was now celebrated as a symbol of courage. No amount of wealth could buy that moment. No power could erase it. Richard looked away, trying to escape the judgments. But there was nowhere to run. He was trapped in his own spectacle, now a defeated villain. The silence around him was deafening, contrasting with the roar of applause surrounding the young woman. For the first time, he felt public shame firsthand. The scene ended like a living tableau. In the center, the enlightened young woman receiving heartfelt applause. On the sidelines, the millionaire cowering in silent fury. It was the perfect portrait of the reversal of power. And everyone knew that, from then on, no one would ever forget the impact of that night. The hall was still vibrating with applause when the host of the party, an elegant man with silver hair, rose from the head table. He walked toward the center of the dance floor, where the young woman stood, motionless, still surprised by the audience's reaction. His steps were firm, and silence gradually returned, as everyone knew an official gesture was about to take place. With a cordial smile, the host extended his hand to the young woman. "Miss, your dance was a gift for this evening. On behalf of everyone, I thank you for the courage and beauty you showed us." His voice echoed through the hall, clear and respectful. The audience responded with renewed applause, not only for her, but also for the decision to publicly recognize her worth. He then gently led her to the table of honor, a place reserved for the most influential figures. The gesture was symbolic, but it had enormous repercussions. Inviting someone so despised just minutes before to the most prestigious place was a sign of irreversible change. The entire room understood. The young woman was no longer an intruder. She was a legitimate guest. Richard watched the scene with his blood boiling. The host's every gesture was a stab to his ego. The girl he had ridiculed was now celebrated, and his opinion no longer carried weight. He tried to muster a smile, but the cold stares of the other guests made it clear no one was willing to follow him in this farce. He was alone in his wounded arrogance. Some of those present began approaching the young woman, offering compliments. "You were magnificent," said a woman, wearing a diamond necklace. "I've never seen such courage," commented a young man. These words, simple but sincere, cemented her new position in the ballroom. The audience, which had previously judged her, now gave her a standing ovation, not just for her dancing, but for what she represented. Meanwhile, Richard felt the eyes turning on him. It was as if he were naked before everyone, exposed in his cruelty. The whispers were no longer about the intruder, but about his arrogance. He wanted to humiliate her, and he ended up humiliated. Someone murmured, eliciting discreet nods of agreement. The Night King had lost his crown. The host raised his glass and declared loudly, "May this evening be remembered not for arrogance, but for courage and truth." The toast echoed through the hall, and everyone raised their glasses in response. The gesture was more than celebration. It was an indirect judgment against Richard, who stood motionless, unable to raise his own glass. The young woman moved, sat discreetly at the table of honor, her face flushed with shyness, but also with gratitude. She hadn't sought glory, but now she had it. She felt accepted, recognized, and above all, liberated. This was confirmation that her dignity could not be stripped away by any insult, no matter how cruel. Richard, defeated, remained isolated in his chair. The friends who had once laughed at his jokes now avoided him, as if his shame might infect them. Loneliness was his punishment. He, who had always thrived on collective laughter, was now consumed by silent contempt. And this silence was more painful than any scream. The contrast was complete. The poor, barefoot, and humiliated young woman was now a symbol of respect. The arrogant and powerful millionaire was now the living example of defeated pride. The room would never forget that moral turning point. No matter how much money Richard had, in the face of the truth, he had lost it all. The hall, still illuminated by the glow of the chandeliers, seemed different now. The atmosphere of arrogance and ostentation had given way to something rare, genuine respect. The young woman, seated at the table of honor, looked around as if she still couldn't believe what she was experiencing. Her bare feet, once a source of ridicule, were now a symbol of courage. Every glance cast her way carried admiration. As the guests resumed their conversation, it was impossible not to notice the silence surrounding Richard. He remained motionless, the glass untouched before him, his face rigid as he tried to hide his shame. There was no longer an audience to laugh at his jokes, no allies to echo his cruelty. He was alone, surrounded not by respect but by contempt. The young woman, for her part, did not seek revenge. Her heart did not rejoice in his downfall, but in her own silent victory. She had no need to humiliate him, for he had already condemned himself before everyone. The simple fact that he had remained steadfast, that he had not backed down, was the greatest answer, and that was enough. Some guests approached once more, offering discreet praise. "You taught us a lesson today," a lady said with a trembling voice. "I will never forget your courage," commented a young gentleman. With every word, the young woman felt that her story would not be forgotten. That night, she had achieved something no amount of money could buy, recognized dignity. Richard averted his gaze whenever he passed someone. Every expression directed at him was a painful reminder of his downfall. His pride, once unshakable, was now shattered. The image of the untouchable man had been shattered, and no one would ever see him the same way again. He was a living example that arrogance does not sustain eternal power. The host raised his glass once more, this time not to celebrate wealth or status, but to honor a higher value. "Let us never forget," he declared firmly, "that true greatness lies not in the gold we carry, but in the courage we display." The toast was followed by unanimous applause, and Richard's name was not even mentioned. The young woman smiled humbly, her eyes brimming with tears. She felt lighter than ever. It didn't matter if she returned to the streets or faced new challenges. Nothing could erase that moment. Victory lay not only in the applause, but in the recognition that even in the face of cruelty, she had chosen not to give in to fear. As the closing music filled the room, she glanced discreetly at Richard. There was no resentment in her gaze, only compassion. He had underestimated her, but deep down, perhaps he was a prisoner of his own vanity. His true defeat lay not in the public judgment, but in the emptiness he carried inside. The hall was beginning to empty, but the story of that night was already etched in everyone's memory. A poor girl had become the hostess of the party, not through wealth, but through courage. The millionaire, in turn, had discovered that power without humanity is merely an illusion. The lesson had been taught, and no one would ever forget it. And then, looking at the audience one last time, the young woman left an invisible message, but one felt by everyone. What would you do in this situation? Have you ever witnessed someone being humiliated in public? The invitation hung in the air, an inevitable reflection. The audience, moved, knew the story didn't end there, because each one now bore the responsibility of responding. Epilogue. That night, the ballroom wasn't remembered for the jewels, the crystal glasses, or the displayed fortunes. It was marked by a barefoot girl who dared to dance when everyone expected her downfall. She proved that dignity doesn't need luxury, and that courage is the greatest of riches. Richard, the millionaire, never forgot the public embarrassment he faced, but for others, his arrogance no longer held any weight. What everyone remembered was the young woman who turned humiliation into triumph, silencing a crowd with courageous steps. Stories like this remind us that true greatness isn't measured by the money in our pockets, but by the strength of our hearts. And perhaps the question for each of us is simple. What would you do in the face of injustice? Would you remain silent, or would you have the courage to dance? If this story touched you, leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more. Narratives that inspire, move, and make you reflect.